Today, we are diving into a really fascinating idea. It comes from a source document that says a single powerful principle can help us make sense of some of history's biggest, most confusing contradictions. And it all kicks off with a puzzle that has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries.
All right, so let's just jump right in with a question that's been debated for ages. If you've ever really sat down and read the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, you might have noticed that their family trees for Jesus, well, they don't exactly line up. And this biblical puzzle is our way into the big idea we're going to unpack today.
I mean, when you put them side by side, the differences are pretty stark. You've got Matthew, who traces the lineage through the royal line of King Solomon. He's clearly writing for a Jewish audience. But then Luke goes a totally different way, through another of David's sons, Nathan, and his list is way longer, emphasizing this universal connection. But here's the real head-scratcher. They give two different names for Joseph's father, Jacob in one and Haley in the other. So what's the deal? Are these just mistakes? Sloppy record-keeping from 2,000 years ago? Well, according to the document we're looking at, the answer is a hard no. It suggests something else entirely, that this conflict isn't an accident at all. It's intentional, and it's there to serve a higher spiritual purpose. And this is it. This is the key the source document says unlocks the whole puzzle, the principle of opposition in all things. The idea is that tension is kind of built into the very fabric of the universe. From this point of view, conflicts and contradictions aren't bugs in the system, they are the system, and they're designed to force us to make a choice, to test our faith. Now, the source doesn't just pull this idea out of thin air. It grounds the whole concept in this specific scripture from the Book of Mormon. What it's basically saying is that without opposition, without that tension between two competing ideas, things like righteousness or goodness wouldn't even mean anything. They'd have nothing to be compared to. So, how does this help us with the genealogies? Well, the source frames it as a choice between two very different ways of seeing things. The first path sees a contradiction and just says, see, the text is flawed. But the other path looks at that exact same contradiction and sees it as an invitation, a kind of challenge to dig deeper and look for a spiritual meaning. Okay, so this is where the source document really starts to expand on this idea. It argues that this isn't just a one-off explanation for the genealogies. It's actually a repeating pattern, almost like a spiritual law that you can see playing out in huge events all throughout history and scripture. And it gives 5 big examples to make its case. First up, the fall of Adam and Eve. It's framed not as some tragic mistake, but as the necessary opposition that made human life possible in the first place. Then you have the crucifixion. What looked like the ultimate defeat was actually the ultimate victory. The source even points to the conflict between Nephi and his brothers in the Book of Mormon as being the very thing that forged a new nation. See the pattern? In every one of these cases, the argument is that a moment of intense opposition unlocked a much greater purpose. And the pattern doesn't stop there. The document then turns its attention to another famous set of so-called discrepancies in the Bible, the different eyewitness accounts of Jesus' resurrection. A lot like the genealogies, the 4 gospel accounts of the empty tomb don't perfectly match up on all the little details. How many women were there? Was it 1 angel or 2? Critics love to point these out as contradictions. But the source argues, hey, this is exactly what you'd expect from different people witnessing the same shocking event. The key from this perspective is that while the tiny details might shift, the core, world-changing message, the tomb is empty, he is risen, is exactly the same in all 4. Then the source document takes this whole principle one step further. It proposes that there's a direct relationship here. It's almost like a law of spiritual physics. The more divine good or truth something contains, the more intense and fierce the opposition against it is going to be. And to really drive this point home, this source draws a pretty stark parallel. It compares the opposition that Jesus Christ faced, which ended in his crucifixion, to the persecution that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, faced, which also ended in his martyrdom. From this point of view, the sheer intensity of the violence against them is actually presented as evidence for the truth they were carrying. All right, so after building this case from scripture and history, the source makes a big leap right into the present day. It claims this principle of opposition isn't just some old historical thing, but that it's actively playing out right now in what it calls modern spiritual warfare. And it's really important for me to be clear here. What's coming up is a direct explanation of the source's specific and, potentially controversial viewpoint on this. So, according to the source, one of the main strategies in this modern spiritual battle is to just blur the lines between right and wrong. The goal is to create this sort of spiritual fog where it gets really, really hard to tell which way is up. And to back this up, it points to the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, who described a time when everything would get flipped upside down, when destructive things would be called good and good things would be called evil. The source is essentially saying that this ancient prophecy is a perfect description of our world today. And here's the specific modern example the document gives to make its point. It argues that people with good hearts can actually be tricked into supporting causes that are, from its perspective, deeply destructive. The source specifically cites widespread support for Hamas under the banner of social justice as a major example of this moral confusion. The document goes on to say that while Israel is imperfect, it stands on the side of good when compared to an ideology like Hamas, which it says openly celebrates violence. The source wraps this up by concluding that this exact kind of moral inversion is a clear sign of what it calls spiritual warfare. So, after walking us through ancient genealogies, historic events, and even current global conflicts, the source brings it all home. It really gets down to the core question. What is the whole point of all this opposition anyway?
And what it does is boil everything down to a fundamental choice between two paths. On one hand, you have what it calls the world's path, which is all about trusting cultural trends and what everyone else is saying. This, it argues, leads to that moral fog. On the other hand, you have the path of faith, which is about trusting personal revelation and divine truth, which leads to clarity. So one path sees a contradiction and calls it a flaw. The other sees that same contradiction and calls it a test.
And this right here, this really gets to the heart of the entire document. The argument is that opposition in all things isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. No, it's the actual playing field of life. It's the arena where our freedom to choose, our very agency, gets put to the test every single day. Which kind of leaves us with the final question the source wants us to think about, right? The next time you run into some confusing contradiction, whether it's in an old book, in the news, or just in your own life, what is it? Is it just an inconvenient flaw in the system? Or could it be something more? A deliberate, divine test of your faith?